Good morning, class. Hopefully you've got our vocabulary words down. We're on to our first story for the week. It's narrative nonfiction. The title is Rescuing Our Reefs. Our essential question is, how are living things connected? We want to read to see how plants and animals are connected in the coral reef ecosystem. Remember, ecosystem is all the living and non-living things. Sitting on the side of the boat, the photographer fixes her scuba tank and mask. She waves to the man in the fishing boat. Then she dives backwards. It's not really a dive, it's more like fall off the boat, whoosh, backwards into the clear water of the Florida Keys. She swims, breathing through her regulator. That's this thing right here. That's called the regulator. A large, colorful coral reef is laid out before her eyes. Sea anemones, red hindfish, gaudy parrotfish, yellow angelfish, and other animals ignore her as they go about their business. Life in the reef has flourished and grown. So that's awesome. Flourish means that it's going well. Good soil makes plants flourish. Obviously, there's some things that you have to have a reef that flourishes. Let's find out more. Connections. The photographer knows the plants and the animals in the reef ecosystem need each other to survive. Reefs are made up of billions of tiny animals called coral polyps. Plant-like algae live inside the coral. The algae uses a process called photosynthesis to turn energy from the sun into food for themselves and for the coral. In return, the coral gives the algae a home and the carbon dioxide needed for photosynthesis. Algae are part of the food chain called producers. Producers make their own energy. So algae is a plant, and coral is actually an animal. Even though it looks like a plant, it's an animal. And it breathes in oxygen like you and I do, and it breathes out carbon dioxide. Well, the plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen, so they kind of exchange this air. The photographer sees a blue and yellow parrotfish nibbling on the coral. She takes a picture. The parrotfish breaks apart the coral to get to the algae-filled polyps inside. In the food chain, the parrotfish is a consumer. And there's a picture, and you see their special beak for breaking that coral. Consumers cannot produce their own energy. As the parrotfish eats the algae, energy is passed through the food chain. In the distance, the photographer notices a long silver body of a barracuda lurking. The seagrass ripples in the current, swaying back and forth. It almost hides the hungry predator. She snaps a photo and swims on. So the predator, the barracuda, has very, very sharp teeth, would love to eat the smaller fish, a parrotfish. Coral bleaching. The photographer shoots more photos as she swims. The reef must have looked like this hundreds of years ago, but then she stops and stares at a big area of bleached white coral. Once colorful, the whitish coral now looks like the broken pieces of a crumbled castle. Coral depends on a natural balance to stay healthy. Climate change and pollution can cause an imbalance. So if the water's too hot, that can affect the coral. Some areas have dried up from droughts, while others have had more rain. Too much sun and warmer ocean temperatures can cause coral bleaching. If pollution gets into the water, or if the water gets too warm, the relationship between the coral and the algae breaks down. The algae stops making food. The coral rejects the algae. The algae are what give the coral its color. The coral loses its color. It stars because it needs the algae to make food for it. So we got warmer water. This is affecting the coral, which is affecting the algae. The algae leaves, which is affecting the coral. Those two guys work together, and now they're not working together. And, well, we got some bad news. Now, down on the bottom, we got what's called a flow chart. This was described on the page before. The sun gives energy to the producers, which is the coral. The consumers are the little fish. They eat the little algae. And then we have another consumer, or predator, the shark, that's going to eat those little fish. That's an example of a food chain. Many plants and animals depend on the coral for food and shelter. As more and more coral reefs die, many animals and plants that lived in these reefs may become extinct. The beautiful reef the photographer had seen earlier would resemble the white crumbling reef before her. It's a balancing act. She turned and swam back to the boat. Later today, she would send her photographs to the Nature Conservancy. It is an organization that works to rescue our fragile reefs. Fragile meaning easy to break. Scientists there are trying to rebuild the reefs by attaching small pieces of staghorn coral to concrete blocks. Staghorn coral is used to grow new coral. Once the coral grows, the blocks are planted in the reefs. The photographer hopes her pictures will help spread the word. They show the relationship between pollution, climate change, and coral bleaching. She breaks through the water surface and climbs into the boat. See how it's kind of told like a story? I got some good shots of the healthy reef and the sick reef, she shouts to her partner. Once aboard, she immediately begins putting her photos on her laptop. All right, guys, so that was our narrative nonfiction, Rescuing Our Reefs. You could enjoy that, reread it on your own. Check out your assignment for today. You may start with your name at the top. It is page 71 if you're checking it out on the bottom. This is one where you have two different directions. One, you want to use the words from the box to answer the question. So they got 8 questions, and then put them out in front. And then you're going to use the word in your own sentence. Okay, some of these scientific words will be pretty easy for you to figure out here. What does the water in a pool do when you jump in? Well, it makes a big splash. Splash is not one of them. What is the water doing when you... Oh, that was like kind of like me jumping in the pool. It's kind of like Mr. Bauer throwing a rock into the lake end. Okay, ripples. And I'm going to use that sentence that I talked to you this morning about at Lake Michigan. Mr. Bauer throws a huge rock in the water, and it makes ripples. Okay, so I put the answer to their question out in front, ripples, and then I use ripples in my sentence, and then I want to box it up, make sure Mr. Bauer knows that I used it. All right, what is another word for delicate? Delicate. Hopefully you're thinking about Mr. Bauer's example of the vase, right? The vase is very delicate. It was very fragile. Here it is, fragile. Now you got to come up with a sentence with fragile. So maybe you broke a glass once. I dropped the glass from the high cupboard, and it shattered all over the ground because it was so fragile. Number 3, what word might describe when something broke into small pieces? Now, fragile would be something that would break into small pieces, but what would a word might describe when something broke into smaller pieces? And I'm thinking about that building there that crumbled. And so this is where we would use crumbled. All right, number 5 is kind of a good one. Hopefully you can, it's used in the sense a little different than I used it this morning. What might be the result if there is too much weight on one side of the boat? And the boat floats, and if all of a sudden a whole bunch of people get on this side, oh boy, that would be called imbalance. All right, I think I did 4 of them with you. You got to come up with your own sentences. Do the other 4. And then you're welcome to put that back into your Monday folder. Double check to make sure you have your name on that paper, and then have a great rest of the day.